Relations and Engagement for the School of Arts and Sciences. I would like to welcome everyone to today's event. If this is your first virtual Scarlet speaker, then welcome. And if you are a repeat attendee, I'd like to welcome you back. As a reminder, everyone's microphones are muted, so there will be no background noise during the presentation. We ask that you submit any questions you have using the Q&A feature, and then when the presentation is over, we will start to take questions from that. If we need any more information, if we need you to clarify, we'll be able to unmute you on our end, and then we'll remute you after you clarify. Please know that these events are not just for Rutgers alums, so if you ever get an invitation and it's a topic that you know someone would be interested in, by all means, please forward the invitation. We welcome everyone. So now I would like to introduce Nicole Fleetwood. Nicole is a critic, curator, and professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She is co-editor of Aperture Magazine's Prison Nation, spring of 2018. It was a special issue focusing on photography's role in documenting mass incarcerations. She has also co-curated exhibitions and public programs on art and mass incarceration at the Andrew Friedman Home, Aperture Foundation in New York, the Zimmerli Museum of Art in New Brunswick, the Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site in Philadelphia, and the Cleveland Public Library. Her exhibitions have been praised by The Nation, New York Times, and The New Yorker. She is the author of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, on Racial Icons, Blackness and the Public Imagination, and Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which won the Laura Romero First Book Prize from the American Studies Association. Please join me now in welcoming Nicole Fleetwood.
Thank you so much, Dana, for that introduction. And thank you also for hosting this event. I want to start by just thanking Rutgers, the School of Arts and Sciences, my departments, American Studies and Art History, for supporting me. I've been at Rutgers since 2005, and it's really a joy to be on faculty. And I really love the students, and I really love my colleagues, and feel a great deal of support from the campus, the university broadly. So I'm going to talk to you about my new book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, that came out just a couple of months ago and at the end of April. And during this time, I've been doing a lot of Zoom events, and I'm really honored to be able to share the work also with my community here at Rutgers. And what I'm going to do is walk you through a series of slides that are in the book, and some slides that are going to be in an exhibition that I'm curating at MoMA PS1, and that's also been very supported by Rutgers. And at the end, I'm really open to taking questions. And I want to start off by sharing my screen and talking to you about the process of working on this book. It is unlike any other project I've done, and that's largely because I started doing this project to really meditate on the impact of mass incarceration on my family. I grew up in Southwest Ohio, in a Rust Belt town between Cincinnati and Dayton that has been completely decimated by deindustrialization and the rise in mass incarceration. So over the course of like a couple of decades of from the 80s to the mid 90s, I just saw most of the young people I grew up with, especially young Black boys, entering and exiting prisons, and many of them never to return. After I finished my first book, Troubling Vision, I started to just think about these photographs that I'm showing you here. These are photos in prison visiting rooms. So as I progressed academically and went on to Stanford to get my PhD, and then got my first teaching job, ended up at Rutgers, every year I would fly back to Ohio at least once to visit my cousins, Alan and DeAndre, and other relatives who were in prison. And during these visits, we take pictures in the visiting room. These are the only photographs that we could have actually that documented our time together as family members, but also that like literally recorded us as family some of us serving time and the other of us, quote, free. So these images became really important, not only for my family and our archive, but also for me in terms of thinking about how do we visually document the toll of mass incarceration on the people most impacted, especially Black working class and poor people, Latinx people, and Indigenous people. Over the course of time, I started sharing this more and more, and actually one of my former Rutgers students, Kara Brownson, is on with her mother, and I want to shout out to Kara, a Rutgers alum, who actually invited me to the Visual Arts Center of New Jersey, I think in 2012, 2013, and it's the first time I did a public presentation on this project. From that event, from that initial event, the project has grown so much, in large part through talking with other people who have been directly impacted by mass incarceration, either people who've been in prison or people who have loved ones in prison. Every time I shared the project, something remarkable would happen. People would come up to me afterwards and they would offer images of their incarcerated relatives. They would share works of art with me. They would tell me about artists who are working on this project, a project around art and mass incarceration. And so I say that for me, this project is really a collective effort. Over the course of a decade, I interviewed over 70 currently and formerly incarcerated artists, activists, teachers, prison administrators, and also relatives of incarcerated people. I started connecting my family's archive, these images here, my cousin Alan, a Valentine portrait that he sent to all the women in prison, all the women in our family. I started to connect these images with other works that were being exhibited in museums or online galleries, thinking about both what's happening in people's personal archives, personal collections, and then what's also happening in the museum world. And what I noticed, especially throughout the 2000s, the 2010s, is more and more shows having to do with mass incarceration, having to do with the carceral state, having to do with surveillance and the impact of prisons and policing and criminalization on certain populations of people. And one remarkable example of that is Dina Lawson's Mohawk Correctional Facility series. Dina is a well-known young African-American photographer who repurposed these photographs of her cousin Jasmine, who would visit her partner Eric while he was incarcerated in upstate New York. And she turned this into an art exhibit that then becomes a part of the Prison Nation special issue that I did with Aperture Magazine. Dana mentioned that early in the introduction, and I just want to show you a few of the images from Prison Nation and also talk about how Prison Nation then led to me finishing the book Marking Time. So Prison Nation, one of the things to me that was really important about that special issue was to think about how photography can be a tool for documenting mass incarceration, but also thinking about the fact that in most prisons, incarcerated people have no access to recording technology, meaning that they have little or no access to audio recording, video recording, or photography, unless they're in a program that's designated to have access to that kind of technology, or if they have a clandestine smartphone, which there are smartphones that populate certain prisons. But I say all that to say that photography is mainly in the hands of the non-incarcerated to document the incarcerated. So part of what that shows is also the role of photography in not only documenting the inequalities of prison, but also in some ways reproducing that. And so with Prison Nation, we were really interested in thinking complexly about not only the role of photography, but the responsibility of photographers who are presumably free, and they're moving in and out of prisons, and they're also documenting people in some of their worst conditions possible, and they're living out their lives as punishment, and often with very little power over how those images reflect the complexity of their lives, and also how those images circulate. So these are conversations that I had with Aperture editors. And it really made me think about the ethics of doing any kind of work around people with less power, especially people who are in prison, people who are, their legal status is as unfree. And so we worked with a series of photographers, many of them who have been doing work in prison for decades, like, for example, Bruce Jackson. Bruce Jackson is a documentarian. He's a folklorist who teaches in the SUNY system. And for 5 decades, he's been photographing and doing audio recordings of people in prison. And one of the concerns of his work, of his lens, is how prisons are very much, how they reproduce basically the slave system, and how often prisons, especially in the South and parts of kind of like Missouri, Arkansas, moving towards the West, are basically created on the remnants of plantations and penal farms where people were forced to labor in forms of different indentured servitude. So this is a photograph that he took in Arkansas. This was a penal farm that's still in operation today. And also on those farms, often incarcerated people will do things like rodeos, and the rodeos are kind of also reproducing and playing into systems of slavery, racial subjugation, where incarcerated people have to dress in attire from prisons of the past. So these are not uniforms that they'd be wearing regularly, but it's in a way, it's like playing nostalgia, in the same way that we are looking at kind of these nostalgic moments around the Confederate flag. So you see those kind of practices also happening in these prisons, and Bruce Jackson's work documents that. We're also interested in looking at women in prison and the rise in women in prison, especially during the drug war eras, and moving into the 21st century, where women are the fastest rising population in many prisons. And so we work with a photographer named Jack Ludersbooth, who was based in Massachusetts, and in the 80s, he worked in one of the oldest women's prisons in the Northeast, photographing women who were in prison and also doing workshops teaching them photography skills. So these are some of his photographs from the 80s. And then I'm moving into some more contemporary photographers like Jamel Shabazz, who's a very well-known African-American street photographer. He's also known for many of his fashion spreads. What many people don't know about Jamel Shabazz, though, is as he was building up his archive of hip hop fashion, street fashion, Black celebrities, he was also a prison guard at Rikers Island, the notorious jail here in New York City, where I'm based. And during that time, he photographed what he saw was this kind of rise in like the crack epidemic, where he saw younger and younger, often Black men, Black boys, going in and out of Rikers. So these are a couple of his photographs. And he has a book, a collection of photographs called A Time Before Crack, where he's really looking at this shift and the shift in policing and criminalization of young people. One of the most somber and difficult series of portraits in Prison Nation is of Angola. And many of you might be familiar with Angola Prison. It is in Louisiana. It is a prison, again, on a former slave plantation. And it is one of the largest maximum security prisons in the world, with almost 6,000 people. Louisiana is a state where if you're sentenced to life, you, for the most part, will serve natural life. It has a very weak parole system. So most of the people in Angola will die there. And something like over 75% of them are Black men who are coming from often the urban centers of Louisiana, like Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Deborah Lester's a photographer who's been working with that population for a couple of decades. And here are portraits of Angola, a passion play that they do at Angola every spring, where incarcerated people direct the show, they direct the play, but they also create their own uniforms. And I want to transition in from talking about photography and its role and responsibility in documenting mass incarceration to look at what incarcerated people are doing inside prisons, the practices that they are cultivating with the materials that they have access to. And as I said, in most prisons and jails, incarcerated people don't have access to photography or video recording unless it's through an established art program. But what they do is they create incredible works of art with the limited resources available to them. And that is really the subject of my bookmarking time, is focusing on those creative practices and how incarcerated people build community across the prison divide. So you'll find incarcerated artists collaborating with non-incarcerated artists. You'll find incarcerated artists using art to connect with loved ones. They're often commissioned by other incarcerated people to make portraits of loved ones that then get sent out to relatives. So art becomes this really important relational practice that resists the isolation and dehumanization of prisons. I opened the book with this self-portrait by Ronnie Goodman. It's one of my favorite works of art. And Ronnie created this self-portrait during his last few years at San Quentin. San Quentin is a prison in the Bay Area in California. It's a prison that's been in the news a lot lately with much urgency because it has one of the worst coronavirus outbreaks in the world. And people have already died. And so there's a lot of push right now on Governor Newsom to release and to act and to treat incarcerated people who are sick with dignity. So if you're interested in more about that, I can put that in the chat room in terms of the activism around that. So Ronnie Goodman made this self-portrait, and for him, it was not just about documenting himself in prison, but it was a work of art to really assert himself as an artist and to put himself in a tradition of other artists who are doing self-portraits, especially as they're making art. So he's reflecting on a lithograph in this painting, and he's also curating around him. He told me that as he painted this, he was thinking about which works of art he wanted to bring closer to him. And these were often works of art that reflected the community that he had created for himself and with others while he was in prison. Ronnie, like many incarcerated artists or formerly incarcerated artists, like Gil Battle is another person, uses the materials and the kind of themes of prison in their work inside prison and outside of prison. So Gil Battle was also incarcerated in California. He's no longer in prison, but he continues to reflect on issues of unfreedom. He says that once someone's been convicted of a felony, that stigma stays with them the rest of their lives, and in that way they remain unfree. And he thinks about this thematically through these sketches that he does with dental tools on ostrich eggs. And so these are works that he's created since being released, but are very much reflective of his experiences and issues that came up for him while he was in prison. So I'm going to move faster through some works of art because I can talk forever about this, but I want to make sure that I give us at least 15 to 20 minutes of discussion. So the ideas around unfreedom and connecting mass incarceration to a longer history of racial subjugation and unfreedom and forced labor comes up in the art of a lot of incarcerated people. It's one of the most common things that I witness and that through my research. And one really strong example of that is Eddie Cates, who's currently in prison in New Jersey. He's been in prison there for almost 3 decades. He started to take art classes in his 60s. He hadn't any experience doing art before, and he actually was enrolled in a program that Rutgers is affiliated with. It's called NJ STEP. And NJ STEP is a really fantastic program that I hope all citizens of Jersey support. What it does is it creates bridges between the highest institutions of higher education in the state and penal institutions. So through NJ STEP, Rutgers professors can teach incarcerated people. And incarcerated people can work towards an AA degree and in some prisons towards a BA degree. So Eddie Cates enrolled in NJ-STEP and was able to work actually with the Rutgers art instructor in an art appreciation class. And the instructor brought in this archival photograph of a chain gang from the early 1900s. And then you see Eddie Cates's reproduction of that, how he reflects on that through this beautiful graphite drawing called Cottonfield 2016. Another artist who is in my book and also will be in the exhibition at MoMA PS1, who really is thinking in very thoughtful and nuanced ways about what she calls the prison to prison pipeline. She says it's not a school to prison pipeline, it's a prison to prison pipeline, is Mary Elizabeth Enoch Baxter. Her triptych video, Ain't I a Woman, is available on YouTube if you want to watch it. It's a 15-minute beautiful video where she's also rapping. She's a sound artist as well as a video artist, and she's rapping about her experience in state prison in Pennsylvania while she was pregnant and in labor, and where she was shackled for 47 hours as she labored to give birth to her son. She uses that both as kind of an aesthetic engagement with issues of gender and racial subjugation, and also as a political tool. She's involved in campaigns in Pennsylvania and nationwide to ban the use of shackling imprisoned women in labor, which still takes place in several prisons, as well as other dignity acts around the experience specifically of women and gender nonconforming people in prison. Jared Owen's Elapsium, I think, is a really powerful symbol of the way that incarcerated people are reflecting on this long history of racial subjugation and how mass incarceration is one component of that. And in this triptych, and by triptych I mean, for those of you who are not, maybe who are new to art or art history, is you see that this one piece is comprised of 3 components. And so that's why we call it a triptych. In this piece, Elapsium, he takes an iconic image that many of you are familiar with, even if you're not aware that you're familiar with it. It's called the Brooks slave ship, and it's an icon of abolitionist activism for like over 2 centuries. And so the Brooks slave ship was used by abolitionists in England as well as in the US to advocate for the end of slavery and to really talk about the cruelties of human cargo and the practices of Atlantic slavery. So what Jared Owens does is he takes the Brooks slave ship and he projects it onto the blueprint of the prison where he was incarcerated in New Jersey. It's called Ferreton. It's a federal prison there. And so he lines up the holding cells, and here you see the holding cells of a slave ship and the holding cells of the prison, and really thinking about those connections. He also uses colors that are very symbolic, and these are colors that maintained order in prison. So for example, the orange that is the ocean was a warning color to incarcerated people of spaces that they were forbidden to enter. So an orange line or orange sign was a warning that could not only lead to more punishment for incarcerated people if they crossed it, but it could also lead to death. So here's another example of Elapsium. James Hoff, who was incarcerated in Pennsylvania for 27 years, he was released in August. He's about to celebrate his first year home. Is also thinking about racial subjugation, but he's thinking specifically about racial capitalism. He's thinking about prison labor and how several industries benefit from systems of punishment, not just prisons in terms of manufacturing products inside prisons, but how incarcerating and punishing and criminalizing people fuel many economies, federally, statewide, and locally. So in this watercolor that he did while he was in prison, he named it I Am the Economy, to think really about those systems that benefit from the incarceration of millions of people, of over 2 million people. And here's another example of his thinking about racial capitalism and prison labor, and it's called How Big House Products Make Boxer Shorts. And the title is both, it's a cruel title, but it's also meant to be playful. And it's thinking about the company in Pennsylvania, the prison company in Pennsylvania, which is called Big House Products, and how they literally make boxer shorts through the labor of incarcerated people, and then sell those boxer shorts back to incarcerated people at a very high profit. I look at the work of James Hoff and also Jared Owens in relationship to a lot of contemporary art practices that are taking place outside of prison. So that you can't see the label for this one, but it's Cameron Rowland. And Cameron Rowland is a really well-known international artist who won the MacArthur Genius Award this past September. And he's known for doing conceptual projects that reflect on what he would call extractive capitalism, in the way that capitalism and economies continue to impoverish Black people specifically. And so this exhibition that was in Lower Manhattan a few years ago is comprised of all items that were made through prison labor. And I do this, and before I move on, I want to say I do this because I want to think about artists like James Hoff, incarcerated artists, directly in conversation with some of the most innovative and thoughtful contemporary art practices that are taking place in museums and art centers right now. And for me, that intervention is really important, to not think about art by incarcerated people as something that just happens on the margins, or something that is relegated to categories of kind of untutored or unschooled art, or categories that I think are not necessarily demeaning, but like folk art and outsider art, those categories don't fully take account of the complex negotiations that are happening inside prison as artists with very limited access to materials, and who are literally unfree, are navigating these kind of choices in their art making. And one brilliant example of that is Tamika Cole's drawing, which has become the face of the MoMA PS1 exhibition. This image has been reproduced now thousands of times. Tamika Cole is a formerly incarcerated woman who lives in Alabama. She was in prison for 26 years. She experienced a lot of trauma and abuse while she was in prison. And she said that art was literally the space where she could go for safety. And this drawing, this graphite collage, Locked in a Dark Calm, uses like the most minimal materials. So it's, images from a magazine that she was able to, of a discarded magazine that she was able to acquire, a piece of office paper. This is a relatively small drawing, and a graphite tool. And in it, she said she created her own calm through the actual making of this artwork. And it was in response to some abuse that she was experiencing by prison staff. In the book, I also look at practices that are taking place collaboratively between incarcerated people and organizations, like I mentioned NJ STEP earlier. Across the country, there are organizations of all scales, all sizes, that are doing educational and art programs for incarcerated people. One of the most well-known is the Arts and Corrections Initiative across the state of California, where you have several different art programs, art organizations collaborating with the Department of Corrections there to provide art making services, classes, and opportunities to exhibit throughout prisons across the state. And one of the most well-known organizations that's collaborating through Arts and Corrections is the William James Association. It's been around since 1977. It's one of the longest running organizations that offer services, art services to incarcerated people. And so in the book, I talk about the complexity of those collaborations across, especially across states of unfreedom and mobility, immobility, and also the stigmatization of being labeled a prisoner as opposed to being labeled an artist. And here's another collaboration that took place among incarcerated people and non-incarcerated people. And this is through the York Correctional Institute in Connecticut. It's a women's prison where the Brooklyn Museum collaborated with a group of women to do this beautiful installation called Shared Dining that was also meant to be in conversation with the well-known work of Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. And here's the dinner party. So in 2015, this installation by incarcerated women at York was actually exhibited at the Brooklyn Museum in a room right next to Judy Chicago. So viewers could go between these two spaces and really think about not only the individual works, but also the conditions of captivity. In part, the placemats that the incarcerated women made were from simple objects that they had easy access to in prison. So for example, a spork, a plastic spork, styrofoam cups, paper plates, this kind of acrylic yarn that they use as a decorative tool and the like. And so here's a close-up of one of the placemats from Shared Dining by Lizette Oblitas, who's also a featured artist in my book, Marking Time. So I'm going to show you a couple more works and then wrap up. I'm looking at the time. So my book and the exhibition features works of incarcerated artists and formerly incarcerated artists. For me, it was really important to also, as I said, to have their work in conversation with people who are doing conceptual work who've never been in prison, but who are thinking really critically and carefully about the rise in mass incarceration in the carceral state. One person who's currently serving time in prison, who's actually was sentenced to death in Arkansas, is Kenneth Reams. Kenneth has been in prison in solitary confinement on death row for about 27 years. He's the youngest person in the state of Arkansas to be sentenced to death. He was sentenced at the age of 18. And so from this space of the death row unit, he is thinking about the ways that prisons and the carceral state continue to impoverish imprisoned people and their families. So this collage here, capitalization, is reflective of the items that imprisoned people on death row can currently buy through third-party vendors, and all of this junk food is sold to them at a premium, at prices 2 to 3 to 4 times higher than what non-incarcerated people would spend for these kinds of goods. I think I'll end with the work of Dean Gillespie, and then if we have time in our Q&A, I can show you more work. Dean Gillespie was, and Dean Gillespie also is a great way of kind of circling back around to my family. I actually met him through my cousin Alan because they were in prison together. And Dean served 20 years in Ohio prisons before the Ohio Innocence Project took on his case, and he was their inaugural person to be released for crimes he did not commit. During his time in prison, and the way he kind of managed what I call penal time, and that's time as punishment, is that he would collect discarded materials. He would collect items that he said he procured, and that's kind of taken without permission from different parts of the prison, to create these elaborate miniatures. And these elaborate miniatures were also an example of like what I call the relational practices of prison art, because the only way he was able to construct these miniatures was through collaboration with other imprisoned people. And these collaborations encourage him to cross racial and ethnic divides in prisons. And for anyone who knows anything about prison, you might know that they are systems of racial apartheid. We know that we live in a nation that is deeply structured around racial inequality. And in many ways, those boundaries, those structural inequalities are heightened in prison, where you have a majority, Black men make up 6% of the US population but they make up close to 40% of US prison population, just to really look at how the inequalities are exacerbated by prisons. Dean is a white man, and he found himself collaborating with Black and Latinx men on these really exquisite miniatures that he was making in prison. And for me, it was really an example of another profound experience of art making in prison, is that it allowed incarcerated people to create communities and collectivities that went against the state mandate. It benefits prisons to keep people isolated around racial lines. It benefits prisons to keep people from having antagonistic relationships. And art became this tool actually to facilitate a whole nother way of relating and coming together in a type of camaraderie that still exists for many of the artists once they are released from prison. And so Dean's work is an example of that. And I'll just move quickly through. Jesse Crimes' work is another example of that. Jesse Crimes was part of a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-ethnic art collective during his time at Ferreton Prison that involved Gilberto Rivera, who's Puerto Rican, and also Jared Owens, whose work I showed you earlier, who's African-American. So I'm gonna actually have lots more work that I can show you, but I wanna make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So Dana, I think we can start with the questions now, and I'll use my answers as an opportunity to show some more of the images.
Great, thank you. So Joyce Harley asked 2 questions. One, where can your book be purchased? But also, what do you think should be done via art to help the victims of the crimes committed by the incarcerated?
So my book can be purchased anywhere you order books. I highly recommend that people order through their independent bookstores. Bookshop.org is a really great resource. You can go there, and it basically works with independent bookstores across the country. So that's my answer to the first question. And then the second question, I appreciate Joy asking around victims of crime. Dana, can you just restate it or reread it? Because I want to make sure I actually answer it, because there was a relationship between art and victims of crime.
Absolutely. What do you think should be done via art to help the victims of the crimes committed by the incarcerated?
So I really, really appreciate that question, and for many reasons, because it's a question that allows us to really think about who's in prison. And often in mass media, we are given a picture of imprisoned people as violent, quote, offenders. And offenders is a punitive word that the state uses to talk about incarcerated people. Most people in jails, detention centers, and prisons are not there for violent crimes. You can go to Prison Policy Initiative, which is a great think tank and resource for all kinds of information on US prisons. So if you want to know more about the kind of statistics of who's in prison and why they're in prison, I highly recommend you go to that site. The majority of people in prison are imprisoned for a status, meaning crimes of poverty. And what I mean by that is informal economies that have become criminalized, and that they have not always been criminalized, but as we know, law and crime, the idea of what is a crime, changes over time. Also, people are in prison because of zip codes, where they live. There's great research by people like a professor at UCLA, Kelly Lytle Hernandez. It's called the $1 Million Project, and it's $1 Million Block Project, where she's looking at zip codes and blocks where most people who are in prison come from. And so there's a direct link between over-policing of certain communities and imprisonment. The more contact that you have, and the more aggressive contact that you have with police officers, the more likely you're going to end up doing time. That's statistically true. So you can look at that information. And the neighborhoods that are most policed are neighborhoods of color, Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Now, in terms of where harm has been done, there are so many people who are working in to reform and even to abolish what is called the criminal legal system. And at the heart of that work is to think about healing communities. And healing communities for many reasons, because when someone has been harmed by someone who's hurt them and committed a crime, more than likely they know that person lives in their community. That person might actually live in their household. And more than likely, that person is also going to be released and come back to that community. So the healing that has to take place is on a multiple levels. So there are organizations like Common Justice out of Brooklyn. They're working together with people who have committed a crime where they've harmed someone and the person who's been harmed by that crime to really think about what does healing and transformative justice look like. Throughout, there's also organizations in Oakland, California, and Chicago that also is doing that kind of work, because prisons don't heal. Prisons often teach people who've been imprisoned to feel more and more alienated from society. And so when they're released from prison and they have this sense of alienation, they're more likely to return to prison, or they're more likely to cause harm in their communities. So we have to think about what healing and repair looks like broadly. I think to not only to address the harm that's been done to victims, but the way that prisons and policing have harmed communities and harmed the nation broadly.
Okay, thank you. Barry Qualls asked, how have prison authorities reacted to your work?
Hi, Barry. And Barry was a very early supporter of this project, and I want to thank him and continue to thank him. So it's interesting. I worked with the Art for Justice Fund, which is an initiative partly spearheaded by the philanthropist Agnes Gunn, who sold a really famous work in 2016 for over $100 million. And she used that money to create this fund called the Art for Justice Fund. And so it funds arts-based programs to end mass incarceration, the Common Justice program that I told you, like transformative justice programs that are finding alternatives to prisons and jails. And so I worked with them to produce a special edition of this book, my book, Marking Time. It's a paperback to be distributed for free to incarcerated people. It was so important for me that incarcerated people be my primary readers for the book. And so before the book was even released to the public, it was sent into prisons across the country for free. The project is deeply political, and I say I'm an abolitionist in this project, and I was concerned about, if the book would be able to enter prisons, and I've been, really pleased to find out that it's entered many prisons, even a supermax prison where someone is in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. His work appears in the book, and I want to just pull it up. His name is Carnell Honeycutt. He's contributed to the book with his sketches of a solitary confinement cell. So I'm just going to pull it up real quick. I'll have to go back and I might have it in another site. But he wrote me and said, "Hey, I received your book," as well as Mark Lofney. Mark Lofney's work is on the cover of the book. So I say that to say that prisons, my experience with prison administrators is as varied as my experiences with students, as varied as my experiences with artists. That some people like Eric Gardenhire, who runs an arts-based media program at a prison in Ohio, is trying to create these connections for incarcerated people to get jobs once they're released, and he sees his work as almost like a type of social service to people who, believe that incarcerated people should be in prisons, in cells, 23 hours a day. So it's a wide variety of people that interview, and their perspectives are varying. I think the most alarming experience I had was when I visited Angola in Louisiana, and the way that the prison administrators and staff talked about incarcerated people with language that was deeply dehumanizing, and also seeing incarcerated people there still literally pick cotton by hand in 2019 or 2018 when I visited. So yeah, there is just a range of experiences. I can't say one. I do think that I never hid from anyone I interviewed that this book is a critique of prisons. And often I had really engaging and interesting conversations. And, you know, and I've always been one to like believe that it's important to be in conversation with people who hold different ideas than I hold. So many of the people who actually shared work with me believe in prisons, even though they know I don't believe in prisons.
Okay, the next question is from Kelly. Have you found museums or galleries to be resistant or at least hesitant to exhibit work done by incarcerated folks? I wonder about this given the persistence or stigmas around outsider art, and perhaps especially regarding incarcerated artists of color, given that white supremacist ideologies and systems remain intact in many museums and galleries.
That is such a great question, Kelly. And I have to say that over the decade that I've worked on this project, my experience with museums has changed. So it started off, and I have to say, with not just museums, but with also like grants and fellowships. In the end, I received a lot of generous support from like ACLS, the Whiting Foundation, the Bellagio, Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio Center, really helping me finish this project. But for the first 3 to 4 years, I really was on my own. And when I would share it with organizations or museums or art centers, there was a immediate kind of visceral pushback about anything dealing with incarcerated people. And on more than one occasion, people would say things to me, why do you want to glorify criminals or convicts, or like just language that really framed incarcerated people as not deserving of rights, of access, of being a part of the broader public sphere. And that for me is deeply troubling, and I disagree with it completely and utterly. And one of my first, most amazing experiences was actually working with Donna Gustafson, who is chief curator at the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers, and I think she's now interim director. And Donna was immediately interested in a project when I told her about it back in 2013, 2014, and actually gave space to co-curate an exhibition of Jesse Crimes' work. It was his first major exhibition once he was released from prison. And that was in 2014. And from that experience, I think that it then opened up other avenues for me to be in conversation with arts organizations and museums. But yes, there has been pushback from institutions over time in terms of the role of museums in promoting art by incarcerated people, but also having very different ideas about aesthetic judgment and value, and the kind of ranking systems that take place in museums and in curatorial practice.
Okay, we have 2 questions that sort of circle around prison reform. One was very general in what do you think about prison reform? And the second one gets a little more specific, asking how do you hope the PS1 exhibition will change discourse and prison reform policy in the country? So kind of, a little bit different, but prison reform in general.
I appreciate both of those questions. And so it's interesting to think about what reform looks like in this contemporary moment, especially given the incredibly inspiring activism of people across the country and across the world around the murder of George Floyd. And I think where there's finally a kind of a public understanding of police work as violence against communities of color and against poor people. So my thought about prison and prison reform is that prisons need to end, that prisons can't be reformed, that prisons, in the very foundation of prisons is the dehumanizing, isolating, they're death machines. And I don't think that any modern democratic society should be invested in institutions that produce those kind of results. And the results are prisons across this country, especially you can look at now during the COVID era, are horrible, are horrifying. And I think we need to come up with other ways, again, I think of dealing with harm, repair, and the root causes of why people go to prison, which generally has to do with poverty and systemic oppression. In terms of the PS1 exhibition, I definitely think that I'm hoping that it will elevate organizations and activists who are doing incredible work. And we have a thought collective of formerly incarcerated people, activists, and organizations that are doing the work locally in the New York and New Jersey area, but also across the nation. I hope that that show becomes a way of elevating these practices of to end prison abuse, police abuse more broadly, and to create community and collectivity for that work, to continue that work.
Someone asked, can you clarify if the PS1 show will be virtual or is it in person?
So the PS1 show was initially scheduled for April. And of course, because of the pandemic, all museums closed down. It is our goal to have it open in the early fall if things continue to remain stable in the New York, New Jersey area. That has not been announced yet. I'm telling you all that this is the first time I've even said that publicly, that we're hoping to have it in early fall, but we're not sure if that's gonna happen. And it will be on site at the museum. The museum is completely restructuring how people will enter that space and occupy that space, working with an epidemiologist to do that kind of work. And there might be some components of it virtual, but for the most part, it will be on gallery walls in the museum.
Okay, I think this might be a good one to wrap up with. Someone at Debbie White asked, what's the best way to get involved with the art program in the prisons? Is there a way for just anyone to get involved?
Oh, that's excellent. So I would say if you're new to this and you just want to figure out like some options and explore some options in your own local community or state, you can go check out a couple of websites. One is Justice Arts Coalition, run by Wendy Jason. And Justice Arts Coalition is great because it is literally a coalition of artists and organizations across the country that are doing arts-based programming in prisons or with directly impacted populations. So that's one. And then if you go to the Art for Justice Fund, if you search it out, they have a website of their grantees, and you'll see a list of like dozens, maybe even 100 or so organizations and artists that are doing this work all across the country. And you'll also, can go to navigate to their individual websites to find out more about those programs. Most states have some way that people can connect with imprisoned or jailed populations to do programming, from arts-based programming to religious programming to educational services. So I recommend that you start local and look at what's available in your community.
I think we have time for one more, so I'm going to paraphrase this one. It's a little bit long from ACE. Essentially, the question is, much of the time art released by formerly enslaved or enslaved individuals was not credited. The artists weren't credited with their work. How do you think having the ability to connect the artist to the artwork now impacts the mass incarceration abolition movement happening contemporarily?
I really appreciate that question. For me, the ethics of crediting incarcerated artists and also how I talk about their work and their narrative, their story in the book was so important to me. So there was a lot of back and forth. Like I brought up Lizette Oblitas earlier, and she was someone who has who takes a lot of care in telling the story of how she ended up in prison. And so before the book was published, I gave that section to her for her, and we went back and forth because I wanted to make sure that it honored her experience and that she felt herself reflected her full humanity reflected in that way. So for me, that's one of the things is really, I'm not interested in art without an artist. Like, I'm very much interested in the artist and the artist story. And so I think the book is very much reflective of that. Also, if there were moments where I came across works of art that I wanted to have in the book, maybe I came across those works through organizations or advocacy groups. If I could not be in touch with the artist, or someone who knew the artist, who worked with the artist, or a loved one, the person's deceased, there's a couple people who are deceased in the book, then I didn't feel like I wasn't ethically, for me, it was not, I couldn't put the work in the book, because these were all works made under conditions of suffering and imprisonment. So for me, it's different than like publishing a reproduction of a collage by Romare Bearden, who's a very famous artist, incredible artist who's no longer living. There's a foundation in his honor. But when we're talking about invisible, imprisoned, unfree people, there's extra levels of care that we have to take in not only talking about that work, but also then reproducing that work. So that's part of it. And I also went through, as a scholar, as a researcher, I had to go through a review process, and that's the IRB, and that's to make sure that's any kind of research that deals with human subjects, especially vulnerable subjects. In prison people are one of the categories of vulnerable populations.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today. Some of the comments, people were really appreciating this presentation. So this was great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So to everybody on the call, you're going to get an email later today with a survey that we ask you to fill out. We always appreciate the feedback we get. This is our probably last event for the summer. We're going to take a little break while people enjoy what summer they can. And then we're going to be back in the fall. We have a full schedule for the fall. It's looking like we're going to continue with about one of these a week, all different topics, faculty, alums, a lot of exciting stuff. So there's a line in the survey where you can send us ideas for topics, as well as volunteer yourself if you have a topic that you'd like to present on, and we love getting those as well. So please do fill out the survey. And then we recorded this presentation as well, so it will be up later today for anyone who missed it. And I think if there's anything else we missed, is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, Dana, I just want to thank you for making this space available, and thank you to the larger Rutgers community. This has been a really great experience for me.
I'm glad we could get you scheduled. I know everyone's very busy, so we were thrilled you could find some time for us. You said you have something tonight as well, so
right. Thank you for plugging that. So this evening, if any of you are interested, this is open to the public. It is called MoMA Virtual Views. It's a conversation between the MoMA curator of photography, Sarah Meister, myself, and Khalil Muhammad, who's an esteemed historian at Harvard and also a Rutgers alum. He got his PhD in history at Rutgers. And we're going to be, I'm seeing if the catalog is here, so I can just show it to you really quickly. We're going to be discussing the work of photographer Gordon Parks, who in 1957 did a series with Life magazine called The Atmosphere of Crime. So people can find out more about that event by going to MoMA's website and clicking on the events. Again, it's free and open to the public, and it's going to be on YouTube.
Great, and 2 Rutgers alums. So
Rutgers alum.
All right, well, I guess that's it then. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.